Okay, great. All right. So on the agenda tonight, we are excited to hear from Dr. Claudia Rinaldi, Katherine Tarpley, and then we'll hear from Chelsea High School students, Emily Menhivar and Jose Garcia. They'll share their observations and experiences, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A. As your questions arise, please place them in the chat and we will answer them in the order they are received, and we'll do our best to answer every question. A little bit about CPS. We're a nonprofit formed in 1982 to protect public education and, by extension, our democracy. Our mission is to promote, preserve, and protect public schools and public education. We believe that all children, regardless of race, nationality, language, gender, disability, or economic status, should have equal educational opportunity so they can participate in our civic and economic life. Massachusetts has been viewed as having some of the best public schools in the nation. However, we know we also have glaring and persistent disparities in opportunity and achievement that separate low-income students, students of color, multilingual learners, and students with disabilities from their peers. This is why we at CPS decided to create this series on race and education. We wanted to address these disparities and uplift the voices of people and communities in the Commonwealth who've been silenced when advocating for equity in public education. So again, I'm very excited for tonight's event, Interrupting the School to Prison Pipeline, and to hear our four wonderful speakers, and I'm honored to be your MC this evening. So our first speaker is Claudia Rinaldi, who is the chair of the Joan Weiler Arno 49 Professor of Education. Her areas of research are the implementation of the multi-tier system of supports framework in urban settings with English learners, teacher education and bilingual special education, and diversifying the teacher pipeline. Claudia has authored peer-reviewed publications and a book for educators called Practical Ways to Engage All Struggling Readers. She leads a graduate certificate program in teaching bilingual students with disabilities and a college mentoring program called Pathways to Teacher Diversity. She served on the Council for Exceptional Children Board as an advisor for the National Center for Learning Disabilities, the National Center for Intensive Interventions, and the Integrated MTSS Fidelity Rubric Grant. She believes it is critical to prepare teacher leaders who serve as advocates and allies for all students. As a Latina and former English learner herself, she believes teachers must respond to the belief that all students can learn and succeed beyond barriers like culture, language, disability, poverty, and marginalization in our country and globally. And welcome, Claudia. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Lisa, for that welcome, and welcome everybody. I'm happy to be here tonight and to share a little bit about the work that I do as part of a teacher preparation program at LaSalle University, but also as part of work that I do in our community to support K-12 schools and to help them to address the needs of students who have disabilities. Like Lisa said, in particular, my area of expertise is working with students who have disabilities and who are also learning English, and we call those students dually identified, mostly because they get services for learning English, but they also need services for their area of disability. So today I'll share some statistics and then some recommendations and solutions as citizens, as school personnel, and as teacher preparation personnel as well. And hopefully can kind of give you some insight into some of the challenges that schools are dealing with that perpetuate this pipeline from school to prison, and the solutions that we could do to continue move forward our efforts around supporting public schools. So here's a little bit of statistics to kind of get us thinking about where the situation is right now with Latinos. And so about 27% of students in K-12 are Latinos. So the numbers are growing. They've been growing for the last 30 years. And about 1 in 4 students are Hispanic in our K-12 classrooms. In terms of dropout, our Latino students are 65% higher, more higher than likely to drop out of school than whites, and 40% than Blacks. So it's really a challenge as we see the numbers rise, then more students tend to drop out of high school. And these are all kind of Latinos as a group, not just the students with disabilities. We'll look at that in just a minute. Some of the challenges that our Latino students continue to have is less access to a computer, to internet, and to time with teachers, which is surprising, but not so surprising when we know that the teaching force is majority white. And so there tend to be less connections between our students who are Latinos with teachers that are white. And that is one of the areas that I try to advocate in schools, is for building close relationships and learning about cultural diversity and cultural background of our students. And to put things in context, although most of our students in K-12 are behind, as we look at national standards, Latinos are 41% at grade level. So about 60% of them are not at grade level in reading, and about almost 70% are not at grade level in math. And those are kind of the statistics that we start seeing that create this school to prison pipeline. And so when we think about what we could do as citizens, as parents, and as community agencies, and universities and school districts to kind of disrupt this school to prison pipeline.
I'm sorry, Claudia, to interrupt, but the translator is asking if you could speak a little more slowly.
Okay, sure. We need to kind of look at what we could do to break those barriers and deal with breaking the school to prison pipeline. Some other statistics that are very particular to the school to prison pipeline are that our students are suspended twice as much as white students, and particularly they're suspended on their first offense in school. And so when we compare them to white students, so it's really important to think about and learn about what happens in schools so that we could advocate, through our voting rights and through our support of public schooling, so that those numbers come down and are equal proportions in our community and in our schools. And the last statistic here looks at Latino students who tend to be 3 times more likely to be identified with a disability. For those of you who know anything about disability, we know that disability occurs in equal proportions across all the population. So this 3 times should really not be happening. And what it tells us, and what research has identified, is that they are identified with a disability because we're testing them in ways that it does not give us information on where they truly are. For example, they're testing mostly in English, and compared to English-speaking students, which causes the process that schools use to over-identify them with a disability. Moving from here forward, I wanted to really talk about those students who are dually identified, like I said, who have a disability and who are English learners, because the particular outcomes for this population are worse than just Latinos in general. So although we saw the graduation rates, now we're looking at students who have a disability and who are learning English or who are Latino. And 1 in 8 have a disability and are Latino or bilingual students. And 1 in 3 does not graduate on time. And 1 in 7 drops out of school. So the numbers tend to be larger for students who have disability in these outcomes. At the bottom of the screen, I have a report and 2 links that provide those links to where this information comes from. But these are very recent reports. And although Massachusetts is #1 in the nation for education of our K-12 students, we are actually one of the last states for educating bilingual students, and in particular Latino students. So a couple other problems that are happening in our school system that also exacerbate the school to prison pipeline is that the overrepresentation because students are over-identified in special education. So about if we look at students that are learning English, there's about 10% of students in the US, but in special education, they're over-identified about 15%. So we estimate that about 3/4 of students in special education are misidentified. And that is one of the problems that then leads the school to prison pipeline, because students with disability are less likely to graduate with a high school diploma and less likely to secure positions that would allow them to be contributing members of society. So to kind of give a little bit perspective of disability, there is an education law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Law, and that's how schools identify and provide services for students with disabilities. And I think Katherine will speak more to that. But there are 13 areas of disability that students can be identified. And although there is a process that we'll look in a minute, once students are identified, they're supposed to be provided with what we call an individualized education plan, or an IEP. And this plan is supposed to address the academic and social needs of the child each year. And so what happens is general education and special education in our public schools should work together to ensure that the students are still getting an education, making progress towards grade level, and reporting to the parents and to the school system and federally how they're doing each year. And a lot of the problems that happens of why students with disabilities do not graduate happen exactly during this process, because when we start seeing one of the problems of the school to prison pipeline is that these processes are not truly individualized. And these processes are not meeting the unique cultural and linguistic needs of Latino students in particular. So one of the other problems that happens is we don't involve parents as the essence of the law wanted them to be, which were team members, but they're often the expectation for parents who are Latinos is that they're not interested in participating in their children's education. And so there's little effort from schools, even though they're required to ensure that parents come or that they get information for parents. And parents are the first teacher of these students and have the richest data to share with the school district. So what we end up doing is providing really an English-only education for students that are bilingual and Latino, and the education that is not culturally and linguistically responsive to them, which sets them for failure. So where did the problem begin for our Latino students in our school? And that really begins when they have this double burden of learning English, but also learning to read. And so we call that a double burden. So whereas most of our white students are coming in ready to learn to read, our Latino students are coming needing to learn to read and to learn English at the same time. And if teachers are not effectively addressing both needs, they tend to fall behind on much faster rates. So then academic problems may also show as behavior problems. And once they're behavior problems, we start disciplining them and putting policies in place that support that school to prison pipeline rather than supporting academic progress and growth and success. So in Massachusetts in particular, even though a new bilingual law passed in 2017, that was 5 years ago, we continue to teach students through our English-only approach called sheltered English immersion, and we leave the first language behind. What research tells us is that if we are addressing the first language, students make the transition to English and to learning to read in English much faster. So policies that were passed in 2002, majorly in California, Massachusetts, and Arizona, have kept our students falling further behind and identified more in special education because they are pushing an English-only agenda, even though research has continually shown evidence that bilingual education, and particularly dual language programs that provide instruction in both the native language and English, have better outcomes for our students who are particularly of Latino background. Other problems that happen is the lack of teacher preparation and expectation from the states and federally to provide teachers the requirement to truly learn how to teach bilingual learners and to learn about culturally responsive practices. They also lack a lot of professional development that is needed to continue for teachers to continue to learn how to address the needs of students who have this double burden of learning to read and learning the academics. And the last problem is when community agencies, educators and families, and even doctors want to help and think that special education is a way to get services. And although it is a way to get additional services for students who are struggling, it's not always the right service. Again, the right service may be language supports for learning English as they're learning to read, academic supports, additional reading instruction and intervention, and it could be special education. But I think for tonight, what I want everyone to take home is knowing that the outcomes for students with special education are pretty dismal and less likely to graduate from high school and less prepared to go into post-college and career readiness areas. So when we see special education as the only game in town to get additional supports, it's really important that we really truly investigate whether a Latino student who is learning English has a problem with learning or is just in the process of learning a second language. I know for myself, it took me 5 to 7 years to become fluent as an English speaker. And so, I came in with, good established literacy instruction in my native language, but that's not the case for all students. So it may take a little bit longer and additional supports, but not always special education. So here, if we are going through the process of special education referral, I kind of wanted to show what it looks like and kind of give you what Latino students may need and their families as they're going through this process. So one is we typically don't individualize how to test whether students know the language before we use English only test. So the first recommendation of what Latino students need in the process is ensuring that if they are tested is through observation and not through IQ or achievement testing, because IQ and achievement testing compares them to white students in the norm sample. They're not comparing them to students who look like them, who speak like them, who pick the background. And so observation in the classroom and diagnostic skills testing is the best way in the process of evaluation, either at the general level or when special education evaluation is in place. The second thing that Latino students need in the process is ensuring that there is instruction in academics towards standards and English language proficiency. Oftentimes what I see in schools when we do consulting is they're providing the academic instruction, but they're not providing English language supports. So they're really not getting a way to understand or access the content of the standards. And so they fall further behind. So it's the onus on the school district to ensure that their teachers are providing both to deal with that double burden. The third aspect that Latino students would need if they are struggling and potentially referred is involving the parents at any cost. There is a misconception that Latino parents are not interested in their children's education, and that is a misconception. In fact, as Latinas, one of the things that we want to ensure is that our children behave when they get to school so that the teachers can do their job. And so if we are interested in them behaving is because we care about their education. And so ensuring that there is a way to involve parents in a way that is culturally responsive is key. For example, this is a very simple solution that school districts don't use, and that is using WhatsApp as an application or a way to reach parents, because that's the way that Latino families interact with their native countries, with their families, with their friends. And one way to access them is through WhatsApp, which is an app on your phone that allows you to text and call that is more accessible to that community. Other ways are to actually send school personnel that speak the language of the students to the home to explain the process of special education referral ahead of time and be able to share with them what it looks like. What I find is a lot of parents end up participating in this process and just signing, but they're not a true member. And being a member of that team as the first teacher of that child is the most important step. You have information, Latino parents have information on developmental milestones, on the medical history, on the family history, on the background, on anything that the first year, 5 years of life has brought to their child. And they could give you information on how that is affecting their own interactions and learning in the classroom to differentiate whether it's a language difference or a learning disability. And then the last part that Latinos need is to have the school district or the administrator and teachers ensure that they provide progress monitoring or monitoring of the progress that they make both in academics and English language. Now, this sounds basic, but oftentimes what we're finding in IEPs is that nobody's actually monitoring whether the students are making progress. In fact, in one recent school we were at, what we noticed was that children were losing English language over the last 4 years. And nobody had really caught the fact that it's just a student with a disability, they're not making progress towards grade level standards, and there was nothing uniquely done to address that. So these 4 areas, I think, are quick solutions that could change the way that the process happens. On the right-hand side, this is typically where the student begins. Then there is a process called a pre-referral, which is where teachers get together and start looking at what is the problem. And then they decide whether they refer to special education evaluation. And that's where it would activate special education services through an IEP or that individualized education plan. So I wanted to show you a little girl and kind of get us to think about how this would play out. So this young lady is bilingual and bicultural Latina. She speaks, she's learning English, but she speaks some English. She has 2 years of schooling in English. She was born with a vision problem that causes a lot of headaches and blurred vision with potential childhood glaucoma, so it's serious. And she's reading, she's doing below grade level in reading and math, and has a lot of absentees in school, so about 60% of the time. She was referred for special education services, and she was only tested in English. So when we looked at her records, she was only tested in English. And when tested in English, she is going to show that she is below grade level. Now, what we don't know is maybe she is not below in her native language, but this information that the school collected did not give us that. And the danger for this little girl is that it may, although she does have these neurological vision problems and headaches, it may or may not affect her educational performance. Just like attention deficit disorder may affect school or it may not affect school. And special education services are for students who it affects their educational performance. But if we test them only in English, what we're testing is whether they know English, not whether they know the academics. And so it's hard to understand whether what she is being identified with is truly an area of disability or is just a lack of learning the language and, you know, having some vision problems that could just adjust with some accommodations without really putting her in the track to go into special education and have poor outcomes. So I just wanted to kind of put a child's face to it and know that there are many challenges that happen in the process, even though the process seems pretty straightforward. So the next few slides will kind of talk about every different stakeholder and what we could do. So what public schools can do is establish a culture of rigor and advocacy for all Latino students, meaning that every teacher should be advocating for every student who's a Latino student to be learning both academics and English towards grade level. They can ensure that instruction towards grade level is happening as a priority and ensuring that they're monitoring that. Public schools can also define for teachers when is appropriate to refer a student who is Latino learning English. And that, even though, again, these may sound very basic, this information is not available for teachers most of the time. The schools can also monitor progress towards grade level achievement and align supports. Right now, I think they don't monitor that progress, and so they're just providing supports in general to all students. So really looking at the Latino population, looking at their English language development, and looking at where they are towards grade level achievement, and then moving supports, either personnel or interventionist or additional time should be then aligned to those supports. Another thing that public schools can do is align the IEP to include language goals. And right now, those IEPs, those individual learning plans, do not really address language goals. So again, we continue to provide English intervention in special education that does not, it's not accessible to the students because there's no language mediation in the process. And monitor growth of each student. We don't want to lose growth over time. And special education is very clear that there must be academic benefit for students each year. So although the law is there to secure that, the processes in schools are not always ensuring that this happens, in particular for Latino students. State education agencies, another stakeholder group that could help. And one of the challenges that it has is that it doesn't have enough resources for school districts. In this map, one of the things that we found in a study we conducted was that only about half of the school education agencies that provide guidance to schools, to public schools, provided any information to help school districts know more about how to support Latino students, students with disabilities, and students learning English. So pushing them to, as citizens, to provide those resources as a priority for this population would be really important. And lastly, I thought about what we could do as public citizens to bring in changes. And, you know, so I had 4 ideas here, which was to advocate for districts to disseminate research. And oftentimes districts don't consume educational research. So how can we help them bridge that together? How can we advocate for families to receive more guidance around the IEP so that they know how to support their children? Advocate for state laws so that information and programs like the Look Bill for bilingual education is actually happening. And then being intentional about public sharing of problems like this organization is doing tonight to continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was such a rich in information presentation. A lot of it was new to me, but a lot of it resonated with me because I had a child on an IEP. The idea of parent being supposed to be, you know, an essential member of the team was something I understood and understood didn't actually happen. So, it's a nice segue to our last part in the series, which I'll talk about at the end, which is going to delve into the Look Act, which you referenced, and obstacles to the implementation of that and the importance of dual language instruction. So thank you so much for that very rich presentation. And someone in the, Jim in the chat is wondering if you would be interested in sharing your slides. Yes, okay, thank you so much. Okay, so now turning to our next speaker, Katherine Tarpley, joined the Children's Law Center of Massachusetts in January 2019 and heads CLCM's medical legal partnership with the MGH Chelsea Health Center to advocate for at-risk children in educational matters. Her work focuses on direct representation and community outreach and training. Before joining CLCM, Katherine was the inaugural O'Connell Fellow in the Children's Disability Project at Greater Boston Legal Services, where she represented children who had been wrongfully denied supplemental security income benefits. She also served as an assistant general counsel at the Massachusetts Department of Early Education and Care and worked as a staff attorney in the general counsel's office at Northeastern University. Katherine received her BA from Boston University and her JD from Northeastern University School of Law. And welcome, thank you, Katherine. And I'll just remind you to also speak as slowly as you can for the sake of our interpretation.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone and share some about the work that I do. And, you know, when I was thinking about what I wanted to speak about today, I'm really glad Dr. Rinaldi shared so much about the IEP process, because I was thinking more about, you know, sharing the experiences that that I've been going through with the families and the children that I represent over the last several challenging years. So as Lisa shared, I work at the Children's Law Center of Massachusetts, which is based in Lynn. And the Children's Law Center practices in 3 specific areas of law. We represent children in immigration matters. We represent children in DCF matters, the Department of Children and Families. And we also represent children in education matters. And that is, special education is part of that. But we also represent children in instances of bullying, as well as school discipline. And as I'm sure you all know, special education, bullying, and school discipline all feed into contacts that start, you know, the school to prison pipeline. So what I wanted to talk about today is sharing with you what I've witnessed families go through over the last several years, trends that we observed, you know, during remote learning, as well as this past school year, in how schools responded to those challenges, and the recommendations that have been successful for us, and, you know, and just further recommendations. So to give you a little background on how I meet these families, the Medical Legal Partnership is a unique service delivery model that exists within the MGH Chelsea Community Health Center. So I am embedded into the different departments within the hospital: pediatrics, behavioral health, speech and language, and any child whose pediatrician or provider is in Chelsea, and, you know, through their regular treatment or visits, where, you know, are speaking with a family or a student, and there's an issue that arises related to school. If a you know, flag is raised, they can, just like you refer someone to the podiatrist for your foot, or to, you know, an ear, nose, and throat for your tonsils, you can refer a student to the education attorney. So we have worked to build a really collaborative you know, program with all the different departments to train the staff, whether it's pediatricians or community health workers, to recognize issues that are happening. And so what we observed, the issues that started coming to us when schools closed were really striking, especially in the towns in which, you know, most of the families that I work with live. So we're talking Chelsea, Revere, Everett, Lynn, which, as we know, were some of the hardest hit communities by COVID, but also predominantly Latino. I would say about 90% of my clients are Latino families, and the parents are limited English proficient. So we are embedded in this community, and the issues that we started seeing right away were barriers to access to technology. So whereas most of the students, you know, that you know, are in more affluent towns went home and said, okay, I'll just get on my iPad and start remote learning, these school districts had to get technology into the hands of families. Then once you've got the piece of the hardware, you need access to the internet or Wi-Fi. That's not a commodity most of these families can afford. And then once you've got that computer, and Wi-Fi connection. There's a technology literacy challenge, and that's a barrier, as well as the language barrier. I don't know if any of you remember logging on to Google Classroom or the Clever Backpack. None of that was available in other languages. So that was the first barrier. There are also extreme disruptions at home. Many of the families that we work with are essential workers across all industries. And those essential workers, they kept going and are now relying on older siblings to hold down the fort at home for younger siblings, or we're relying on grandparents who had even less English language proficiency, to help navigate remote learning. The flip side of that is many of these families also lost their jobs. So now they're home balancing multiple kids' school schedules. High school schedule is very different from a middle school versus, a first grader. And they're also balancing those multiple educational concerns with their basic needs: food insecurity, housing insecurity, general health and safety, as well as, worrying about, some of our families were worried about formula and diapers. Really, we're talking basic necessities. So in addition to that, students with disabilities were facing extreme disruptions to structured learning environments, to related services that they were receiving. And these were very destabilizing and traumatic for many students. And on top of all of that, our families for whom English is not the home language were experiencing significant delays in communication. So all of this disruption, what did that lead to? What did that look like for families? It led to a lack of engagement in remote learning and attendance issues, and just extreme stress on behalf of families. And when we looked at how schools responded, there were some pretty negative, and punitive reporting issues that feed directly into the school to prison pipeline. That's not to say, I do want to say that I worked with some school administrators that were, made absolutely Herculean efforts and were very creative. But I will say that collectively, the legal services community, during that first year of remote learning, we collected nearly 100 instances of punitive reporting, and they were, to no one's surprise, predominantly affecting Black and Latino students. And what are some of those punitive reporting instances? So there were three that come to mind. The first is the filing of an abuse or neglect claim with the Department of Children and Families. That's more commonly referred to as a 51A report. We had, so for example, we had a client for whom there were two siblings that had significant destabilization at home related to housing and food insecurity, but they also had several significant mental health diagnoses. And for the middle school student, they just refused to turn their camera on. And that particular school district said, if you don't turn your camera on, we're counting you absent. Well, after a certain number of absences and the parent was trying to get them engaged and saying, how can I reach out? The student is sitting right here. I just can't get them to turn the camera on. They filed a educational neglect complaint against the parent, which led to an interview with a caseworker from DCF. It was ultimately upheld, and what we ended up having to do was appeal that through a program run by our Director of Child Welfare. And that process took almost 6 months of involvement with that state agency. That has actually a really strong, can have a really negative effect on parents, because that finding of abuse or neglect stays on a parent's record for, I think it's about 7 years. So if that parent wants to work and perhaps in education or in childcare, those records are searched, and it can have economic impacts on families, not only on the parent, as well as exposing the student to factors that contribute to the school to prison pipeline. Another example of punitive reporting that we came across was referring students to the juvenile courts for a process called child requiring assistance. And when schools file, it's under habitually truant students. Now, there's actually case law that came out in the last 5 years that defines what habitually truant means, and it's to be willfully truant. And that students with disabilities, in particular, their need, should not be considered willfully truant if what's preventing them from engaging in their education is related to their disability. So there's some strong language in case law around that, but schools were running out of options. How can we reach out to these families? And in some extreme scenarios, we have had several instances of school districts filing a misdemeanor charge of failure to send your child to school against parents for lack of attendance on behalf of their child. So when that happens, it's an extreme disruption both to their education, but also to the family support and structure. So that we saw all of those things happening during COVID. Fast forward to this last year, where we've all returned to in-person learning. There are just so many examples of new challenges that we're facing. And again, I've worked with some really incredible school administrators who are being very creative, but unfortunately, those new challenges that students are presenting are being met with those same ineffective and punitive solutions. So some of the students that I've met through the health center this year are experiencing social and emotional stressors at a level that really schools and providers are sharing that they've not seen before. So we're talking heightened levels of anxiety and depression that are tied to school attendance, tied to their workloads, tied to their performance in school. There are social and peer interactions that students find very stressful after having spent the last year and a half at home. The workload expectations our students are finding very stressful as well. This is leading to additional reports of bullying and physical altercations. I'm sure everyone saw at the beginning of the school year, there were multiple reports of fights breaking out in schools. And in addition, students with disabilities lost a lot of valuable social skills and peer interaction skills and language skills. All of this has led to school refusal, attendance issues, and dysregulated behavior. And again, these types of challenges are being met with interactions with school resource officers, referrals to the juvenile court again, DCF involvement, and again, this is something that contributes to the school to prison pipeline, but it's happening beforehand, right? We haven't even, before you even get to these school interactions with the juvenile courts or with suspensions. Dr. Rinaldi shared a lot of statistics. Students that touch these exclusion processes and disciplinary processes are much more likely to be arrested when they are out of school. If it's a long-term suspension, they're more likely to reoffend and to drop out of school. So that's all to say that before, I think it's my opinion that the biggest way we can support these students and prevent those interactions that lead to the school to prison pipeline right now is to provide as much creative support for social and emotional learning and mental health in schools. You know, we as adults have just barely begun to process how the last 2 years have affected us. Kids are doing the same thing. Like and some of them are so young that they're not even able to articulate how they've changed. We're going to be seeing this for many, many years. And what I am seeing is school districts expecting that the same children that were in school in 2019 are the ones that are coming in 2022. And they're not the same children, and the same supports that we provided to them and the same processes and expectations they need to change. So some of the recommendations, so I'm going to talk about some of the things now that have worked really well when we're collaborating with school districts to address these issues early on to prevent further school avoidance, to prevent referrals to the juvenile courts or to the Department of Children and Families. And the first one is communication. Dr. Rinaldi mentioned WhatsApp. There are so many different ways to communicate with families, and it was very disappointing in the first 6 to 8 months of the pandemic that schools were not making good use of that. So one of the things that I would share with all of you, and all of these things that I'm going to mention are on the Children's Law Center website. It's actually a communication form that we put together with based on guidance from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed. And it actually allows families to proactively indicate their communication preferences, whether it's by text or by WhatsApp or by email or by phone call. If the family works during the school day, they can write down the best times. If there are certain individuals in the school district with whom they've had a good rapport, they can indicate who that person is, and they can indicate what language they'd like to receive communications in. This is incredibly important because there are so many ways that families receive communication at school. One of the ways that the pandemic disrupted that is just backpacks, right? So we have a lot of families that receive communication by putting letters and notes in backpacks. And when students weren't able to go to take their backpacks home, those families stopped receiving communication. So by proactively identifying the best method of communication, not only does it open that dialogue, but it also protects families from school districts who, when filing reports, say, we attempted multiple times to reach out to you and on these types of platforms. But if that was not how the family indicated their preference, that's one way of making sure that schools aren't finding excuses for lack of communication. Another way that communication is really important is to make sure if a child is potentially going to be reported for truancy or to DCF, is to make sure that, and this child in particular has an IEP or has a 504 plan, is to make sure there's communication between the teachers, the IEP team, and the attendance office. For example, I was working with a student, who's actually been a client of mine for many years, and during the pandemic, lost multiple family members all in a very short amount of time to COVID, and was just not able to log on to class. And the parent raised that and was communicating very well with the school and the special education team. But the attendance office had different data, just had a very long list of all the classes the student missed. They actually sent someone out to the school and said, if you don't log into class, we're gonna have to either report you or your parent to the juvenile courts. And They did, without any communication to the special education team. So when I found out, I called the special education team and their attorney and said, why on earth would you do that? And their special education team was horrified. They had no idea that that had happened. And so many times there's lack of good communication between offices in the same school district. So making sure there's communication across the board is really important. It's also important to know that DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed, has issued guidance during COVID about family engagement. And that guidance is really important because it strongly recommended that schools avoid using disciplinary exclusion for when there is an issue of lack of engagement, either in remote learning or during that in-person learning when everything has been different with COVID. When it comes to filing child requiring assistance cases in the juvenile courts, DESE specifically said the juvenile court is not a social service agency and is not a mechanism to obtain services and support for students and families. That's not what the juvenile courts are for. That's what behavioral health interventions are, which is my next recommendation, that families be in touch with their pediatricians or social workers in their pediatrician's office who can make referrals to children's behavioral health agencies across the state. Every local area has them. Some have wait lists depending on if there's a language preference, but for nearly all of my clients, having an in-home therapist or family therapist, having a care coordinator, a therapeutic mentor has made a big difference, not only in the mental health of the students, but it's also to Claudia's point of creating data and bringing rich data to an IEP team meeting. These are individuals who are working with students every day and can provide incredible information to help a school develop services and supports and accommodations to bring a student in school to feel supported. And to also to push schools creatively to think about how to support those students. I have worked with some incredible social workers in schools. This is my plug. If I'm going to get on a soapbox about something, it's how important it is to have social workers, not only social workers that are familiar with working with that particular age group, but that are culturally responsive to the populations of students in their school, that have language skills, because the students that were able to access a dedicated social worker and someone who is able to think creatively about how to get them into school, how to feel supported in school, had such better outcomes than students who did not. And finally, I would say that this type of community education is so important. And I'm really happy to be here, speaking with you all today, but that's what the Children's Law Center does. And so we go and we provide trainings on special education, school discipline, bullying across the state. And so if there are questions that anyone has, whether it's generally or about a specific case, to please reach out to the advocates in your neck of the woods. We actually have this wonderful collaboration between legal services, education attorneys across the state. There are wonderful attorneys in Western Mass, in the South Shore, in Metro West Boston, who can all provide very local specific information about your school districts. So and the Children's Law Center serves Essex County and north of the city. So I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm happy to be here today, and thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Katherine, for all of that really great information and for the work that you do, the work that both you and Claudia do. The problems are somewhat overwhelming, but also the solutions, some of them seem really simple in a way. just kind of less punishment, more communication, and just listening to parents and families and students and giving people support and not just punishing them. So much appreciated. And now I'm really eager to hear from our next two speakers, how they experience all this in their daily lives in school. So next we're going to move to Emily Menhivar, who is a junior at Chelsea High School and a youth organizer from Chelsea with La Colaborativa. She's been fighting for social justice, housing rights, and youth power. She's a member of the City of Chelsea Youth Commission and a leader at La Colaborativa in Chelsea. And welcome, Emily. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Personally, I have been outraged on the ways Latino youth have been affected by discipline policies that have been implemented in my high school. We are now getting our grades severely affected by the E-policy, where if we are absent 3 times or more to our classes, we get an E. This means that regardless of what A you can achieve on getting, your grade is lowered to a D. Not only has this E-policy affected me, but the in-school suspension caused by tardiness. Many youth of color are put responsibilities on them at a young age, like taking their siblings to school, not having a parent around the majority of the time due to work. Youth are also working late hours to survive, etc. So it is no surprise we come late to school. It is no surprise we miss our classes because we are tired. From personal experience, there was a couple of weeks I ended up working 3 jobs and getting up to school at 7 in the morning when I went to sleep at 12 seemed extremely difficult. Even when I arrived home, being surrounded by people who have told me that I was not doing enough, that I wasn't getting anywhere in life, in just a span of months, I had to later accompany my mom to the hospital due to effects of our living conditions. It's not much of a shock that with everything going on, my attendance in school wouldn't be, quote, the best. To be realistic, a white student who lives in the suburbs who can miss 20 plus days of school and just with the phone call from home, everything will get resolved. These policies won't help maintain youth to change their mindsets because we are already struggling as is. We all come from different backgrounds, which is the reality. But if there is discipline needed to be made, try actually conversating with these youth to actually understand the root of all issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Once again, you embody all of these challenges that we've been hearing about from our other speakers, but thank you for sharing your story, your voice, and again, the solutions in some ways seem really simple, just communication and listening and valuing people's circumstances and their voices. So next, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next and final speaker, Jose Garcia, a junior at Chelsea High School and a youth leader at La Colaborativa, where he participates in a carpentry apprenticeship and a housing rights campaign. Those two things go together well. Jose is passionate about youth leadership and housing rights. And welcome, Jose. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. I'm here to talk about the school to prison pipeline and how there's an inherent bias against youth of color that, through labeling young and personal minorities as bad and treating them as criminals, disenfranchises these youth to the point that when they leave high school, they don't have many opportunities left for them. In my high school, we see an example earlier in this year where 2 students were having a fight for no real reason. One of the students, who was a lighter color student, started the fight, and they got away with no punishment, while the other one was suspended for 8 days, and one of the teachers wanted to open a police report against them. And I don't think it's fair that a white passing student can instigate a fight and receive no punishment, while another student of color in the same fight gets suspended for 8 days and police gets involved. And while there's no simple solution to the school-to-prison pipeline, I believe we should start tackling this problem with adultification, which is a process where youth of color are held to a higher standard than other youth and are expected to be more mature than they actually are. By fighting against adultification, we could banish the school-to-prison pipeline with less severe punishments for students, but at the end of the day, this is only a bandage to a problem that needs surgery. And I hope that one day we can fix this issue.
Thank you so much, Jose, for your insights and for sharing them with us tonight. So now we're going to go to Q&A. And I've been monitoring the chat and the comments and questions that have been put in the chat. And I'm going to try and, get to all of them. If you have more questions, for example, for the two students, please put them in the chat. But I'll start. Well, Jim made a lot of comments in the chat. Perhaps everyone's seen them, including school districts need to do more to support English language learners. In many cases, these students are academically gifted and are only quote unquote behind in school because of the language barrier. Jim put some links to Boston Globe articles about some of the problems in the Boston public schools with supporting or the failure to support English learners. He talked about other communications programs in addition to WhatsApp, like Remind and Class Dojo. Mentioned that when the Dever School in Dorchester went into receivership, their dual language program was eliminated, even though research shows that dual language programs are beneficial for both native and non-native English speakers. And a lot of helpful information and comments, and I'll just wrap up those with his comment that Emily, he felt, Emily, you made a strong argument for some form of online coursework, even though he's not 100% in favor of full-time virtual schooling, and that could help accommodate the populations that Emily said have huge responsibilities behind their school day. So wasn't really in the form of a question, but maybe Emily, if you want to respond to that point, because he mentioned you in his comment.
I do believe virtual school learning has its pros, but for me, affected me a lot mentally, and it was kind of hard for me to reach out because everything was through online. What my school has been doing is that it is still, if kids want, they can do online schooling. If not, they can go in person. So I think it depends on the person overall, whether or not they want to do virtual or not. But yeah, thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to that point?
I would say from our college population, is the same experience, Emily, where our students of color, Latino students who I support a lot, have a lot more responsibilities than our white students. So I think it's also important to kind of think that you guys will be moving forward to college soon or to career, and those responsibilities don't die. And the online option could be good if it was a supportive process. But I think right now the teachers handling on-site and online is actually probably worse for students because they don't have the time to access that teacher. And that was one of those points I made, that our Latino students have less access to teachers. A lot of times that's just, part of the access with computers, but it's also part of the access of connection, because the teachers don't understand what their students are going through. And so they say, well, prioritize, your academics are a priority. And it's not that they're not a priority, of course they're a priority, but sometimes eating is a priority. Taking their younger sibling to school at 8 when your school started at 7:40 is a priority for the little one to go to school, so that your mom and dad could have 3 other jobs that they're going through during the day. So I think connection, and like what Emily said, which was to ask the students, why is it that they're late, rather than assume that they're being truant, or that they are not interested in school, or they're not prioritizing, would be more important.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Rinaldi from Ruth Rodriguez, who says that she served on a forum at the Harvard, a forum at Harvard on the school to prison pipeline, and shared the panel with a Suffolk County juvenile judge who shared that since the MCAS became a high school graduation requirement, he witnessed a 200% rise in his court of youth, majority Blacks and Latinos, over 95% of whom had failed the test. And Ruth asked if you're familiar with the harms caused by the racist
Eugenics movement. Yes. So the eugenics movement has been around for decades, and it's part of the reason why our schools do cognitive or IQ testing for students that are referred to special education, and achievement testing, which is similar to the MCAS, but is one-on-one. And that is part of the harm that happens, is that those tests, what they do is they compare to similar populations. It is not telling us exactly how the student is able to do on a particular standard. And so what these tests end up showing is that students that are not part of that norming sample tend to do at the lowest end, and that's how students are over-identified in special education, or not passing the graduation test, or in teacher preparation. These are the same students that are not passing the MTEL teacher test, and so are kept out of becoming teachers. So the point that I made in the presentation was that there is no requirement under IDEA, the special education law, that if a child is referred to special education, that you have to give an IQ test or an achievement test. What the requirement is that we identify whether there's a disability, and there's various ways of looking at whether a student has a disability, rather than just giving an IQ test, or in this case, let's say a graduation test. So a student, for example, if we look at the MCAS, can do a portfolio assessment to show that they meet the standards, rather than taking the MCAS test and be able to demonstrate it in a way that it is relevant to what they're learning and to how they're showing that they could perform when they graduate from high school. On the IQ point, we already know that 2% of the population are in what we call cognitively delayed. So I don't know why we give IQ tests, other than to say that we gave an IQ test and, identify a student, in a way that seems, let's say, more formal than it actually has to be. So my recommendation is not to use any of these kinds of standardized norm tests that only compare students rather than tell us what they know, and look for alternative ways.
Thank you. There was a question from Susan, who asked what special language supports you recommend for students learning English and simultaneously learning reading.
Thank you for that question. So I think one of the ways to learn for those students that are learning English at the same time as learning to read is actually teaching them how to read in their native language. So for Spanish and Portuguese, for example, which are transparent languages, the reading process, the learning to read process could take 3 to 4 months, whereas learning to read in English could take 3 years. So once you learn to read in any language, the process transfers. So you really technically only learn to read once, and then you transfer to any other language. So if any of you were to pick up a new language tomorrow, it's not like you would have to learn to read Italian again or German. You know how to read, it's just you apply the new rules to the language. So my recommendation is begin with bilingual education that teaches the students their native language to read, and then explicitly teach them how that connects to English language. And then the second part is building vocabulary. So a lot of our students struggle because they don't have vocabulary in English that they can transfer from Spanish. So we over focus on decoding and sounding out words in classrooms to the expense of vocabulary. And we know when you had children, if you had babies or you've been around babies, the first thing that parents do is teach them vocabulary words like, what's this? What is that? Tell me the name of this. What color is this? We're always teaching vocabulary first. And that's what happens when you learn a new language. So, using the native language and then transferring that vocabulary into English are the first and two strongest strategies to help them in that area.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense to me. So some comments, but here's a comment and a question from Adebola, who said it was a fantastic session. I learned a lot and I realized there is more to learn. I'm an ally for this cause and I'm wondering what I can do to advocate for English learning students within and beyond the classroom and school. Any suggestions?
I will make a pitch for contacting your representatives. There's actually a bill that is working its way through the final processes. It's the Certified School Interpreter Bill. And as a native, so I can tell you that as a native Spanish speaker myself, the number of times I've been in an IEP meeting or in a school disciplinary meeting. Just last week, I was in a safety planning meeting where the interpretation was so inappropriate that important information that principals were sharing with the family and really personal information that was, very relevant to the topic, to the issue that a parent was sharing about their child were summarized and glossed over. And that's not to say that there is no place for a bilingual school staff member to share information about a schedule or a field trip or where to get your books or things like that. But when you are in a school disciplinary meeting or in an IEP meeting where you have due process rights, and as Dr. Rinaldi said, the explanation of the special education process, the parents' role in it, knowing what they're signing, what they're agreeing to, and what they are waiving, what they are agreeing to pass on, is so important that it's vital to have certified interpreters in those meetings. And so one of the first things that I would push for is call your representatives and make sure they are on board for the school interpreter bill.
I would say that as an ally, the question that I always come in, and I'm not an ally, I'm actually the person, but I always ask the question, how are your English learners doing? How are your special education students? Do you know how many do you have? If a school district administrator or teacher cannot tell you who are their Latino students, who are bilingual, who are your SPED students, they're not doing right by those students, because that should be in the forefront and the work that they do. So I would ask a lot of questions like, oh, who are your Latino students? Who are bilingual students? Who are your English learners with disabilities? Who are your students with disabilities? What are you doing uniquely for them?
Yeah, I just had a flashback to IEP meetings I was in, and actually, even if you speak English, some of the terminology is so not in plain English. Like even if you speak English, it's challenging to understand what they're talking about, what they're telling you. So imagine layering on top of that, not being a native English speaker. Just
and when you're talking with your schools about the annual budgets, or and you're participating in school meetings, having budgets for translation and interpretation services is really important too. So for example, during the pandemic, DESE actually put forth a pilot program giving some of the gateway cities, unlimited funding. They had big pots of money to increase their interpretation services. And every one of those cities took full advantage of it, translating IEP documents appropriately, contacting families. They made full use of that. And it was just a pilot program. Imagine if every school district had access to certified interpreters in the languages. I mean, just in the Chelsea Healthcare Center, our community health workers and translators were able to translate that communication document into 13 languages. And those are the top 13 languages that are seen at the health center. So it's funding for that type of, it's a basic service, I think, to make sure that families are aware of what their rights are and how best to support their students.
Catherine, I'm so glad you mentioned that because right now there is the DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed, is also piloting a new individualized education plan on IEP, and they are not addressing the needs of English learners, and they're looking for public comment. So I'm putting it in the chat, and if you were interested in responding to the public comment and asking about what about the needs of students who are Latinos in particular or English learners, I think it would be really great. And I'll put that in 1 second.
Thank you. We're getting close to the end of our time. I just want to read this comment thanking you all and Emily and Jose for putting a human teen face to all of this and how all this impacts you and your experiences. The absenteeism and it impacting grading is a huge issue for students who have so many things that are out of their control that impact their attendance. So once again, I just want to really thank each and every one of you for sharing your deep knowledge and making it so clear and accessible and pulling everything together. Claudia, Katherine, Emily, and Jose, appreciate you all. And I just want to put in a plug for our next session, which really ties in well for a lot of what was discussed tonight. So watch in your emails for a notice and registration for the last in our 3-part series on Latinx education, a panel presentation on the Look Act and dual language education, which will be on Tuesday, June 7th at 7 p.m. Also by Zoom. It's a little description. The Language Opportunity for Our Kids Act of 2017, which Claudia mentioned earlier, known as the Look Act, endorses research-based programming to meet the educational needs and demographic characteristics of English learners in school districts in the Commonwealth. Compelling testimony will be given by the panelists who are students, a parent, teachers, and experts in the field of dual language education from Mabe, Northeast Mabe, and the Mauricio Gaston Institute for Latino Community Development and Public Policy. So you won't want to miss that. Thank you all so much for coming. I'll follow up with the recording and the slides that Claudia so generously shared with me. And have a wonderful evening, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.